pause for a second and breathe in deeply. As you inhale, you're breathing in little bits and pieces of insects, fungi, bacteria, protists, specialized viruses that only attack specific species of bacteria. And the vast majority of those species have never, ever been studied by scientists. What I want to walk you through today is why all of that life, the bits of beetles, the fungi, the bacteria, and what we do and don't know about it, matters for how we deal with wicked problems. Wicked problems such as COVID-19. So I'm delighted that you will be able to be part of a course like this, a course that involves not just people who are going to study what you study, but instead everyone. My own experience with a course like this was in New York City, in Manhattan. And I was part of a program at Columbia University where all of the entering freshmen went out across the city to study the city. And I helped take students out across the city to study ants. Of course, in Manhattan, what could you possibly discover about ants in Manhattan? There are 10 ant biologists living just in Manhattan. And so obviously everything you could know about ants had been discovered. But as we went out across the city with early medieval studies majors and physicists and biologists and everybody else, what we would quickly find is that two of the most common species in Manhattan were not known to be there. They'd been introduced to Manhattan at some point, and nobody had noticed. And so to me, this was really remarkable because it meant that we're so poor at seeing the world around us that often just having a bunch of eyes reveals something we didn't know was there. Having a bunch of eyes and paying attention. Here are 3 things I want you to know. First, the biological world is far more expansive and unknown than we tend to imagine. Second, that makes extraordinary discoveries possible, even likely. However, it also makes the consequences of our actions hard to predict. And then third, the best way through this unknown is through a mixture of humility, detailed knowledge, and the insights made possible through a diversity of perspectives. At this point, we're going to show you through the example of work that's happening here at North Carolina State University. Now, I want to begin with one of the stories. It's a story of an unlikely character in the grand drama of the biodiversity of life. It's a guy named Terry Irwin. Terry Irwin was a beetle biologist. He imagined he'd spend his entire career out in rainforest collecting beetles, trying to figure out if those beetles were new species, naming those species, and then going back out to find more. And in fact, that's what he did early in his career. And he studied a particular group of beetles, ground beetles, which paradoxically mostly live in the tops of trees. To study those beetles, he needed to find a way to get to them. And so what he did was to devise a new kind of technology, a kind of blower for the tops of trees that would blow pesticides into those trees, and then the beetles would fall out. It was like a great present of beetles falling all around Terry onto sheets that he had prepared. He could then go out, collect the beetles, and begin to sort the ones that were already known to science from those that were unknown, and then take them back to his laboratory and begin to name them and do the hard work of sort of sorting out the species. But as he did this, he started to see something bigger than the beetles, which is that even in the very first tree that he studied, that there were many, many species that were new to science, more than he had expected. And then when he sampled another tree, there were even more species new to science. And then when he sampled a second species of tree, the number of species new to science increased even more. And so, although he was focused on the beetles, he saw something bigger. And that might have been the end of the story, but at about this time, a botanist named Peter Raven wrote to Terry Irwin and said, "Terry, do you think you could estimate how many kinds of insects and their relatives there might be on Earth, based on what you're seeing in your trees?" And so Irwin thought about it a little bit, and he did a kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation. It was really a bar napkin calculation. That's where he did it. And he wrote down some simple math based on the idea that if he knew how many new species were in a first tree species, and then how many extra new species were in a next tree species, that he could estimate the total number of beetle species he might find if he studied all of the tree species on Earth. And he did that calculation, and he added a little bit to account for all of the other insects and their relatives that were not beetles. And it was really very straightforward, and he got his answer, and the answer was 30 million tropical insect species and their relatives. It seemed very simple, but that number, if true, meant that 29 out of every 30 insect species on Earth was not yet named. It meant that if you were to swoop a net through the air and look at what you had gathered, that the vast majority of what you found would be totally new to science. The biological world is far more expansive and unknown than we tend to imagine. Now, my second point has two components. And the first component is, given the scope of the biological world, that enormous discoveries remain possible. But it is truer today than it has ever been because the tools now available to you are so much more powerful than they've ever been. We can now take a little bit of dust from your house and identify from that little bit of dust every species in your house. CSI Dirty Kitchen. We can now take a gene from one species and put it in another species and make it work. And that's happening in labs all over campus. That what we can do is really extraordinary. And even in the time in which you're a student at North Carolina State University, the new tools that we have available to us will increase. But the flip side of this wonder of discovery is that each of us has to make practical decisions in our lives. We have to go to the doctor. We have to think about our medical problems, our family's medical problems. We have to think about what kinds of food to eat. And with each of those decisions, we must make those decisions realizing we still know so little. Consider the natural history and evolution of our own bodies. Modern medicine assumes that we understand the human body and its workings. Yet the body is full of mysteries, universes of internal intrigue. Consider two human organs, the appendix and the stomach. When I was a student, I was taught that the appendix was a vestigial bit of our gastrointestinal system. It dangled there as a reminder, some vague reminder of our past, but did nothing, and every so often it acted out, became inflamed and infected, and had to be removed. And then when I was already a faculty member here at North Carolina State University, one of my colleagues over at Duke University was spinning around in a stool in his lab, and he came up with a new idea for what the appendix might do. This guy's name was Bill Parker, and he's the kind of guy that, were there an apocalypse, you want him on your team. He's a lapsed preacher, a blacksmith. He specializes in trying to do transplants of organs from one species to another, and he's about as clever a guy as you could ever imagine sitting down with. And Parker was thinking about the body, and he was thinking about a couple of observations that he and his colleagues had made. One of those was that the appendix has a large amount of immune tissue in it. It looks like a key part somehow of the immune system. And then the other was that there's a kind of antibody that seems especially pronounced in the appendix, IgA. And IgA, we now know, plays a key role in working with good bacteria in your gut to help to keep them there in your gut. And then there was a third thing, a kind of hint of an idea/observation, which is that it seemed like maybe there was a biofilm, a living layer of microbes inside the appendix. And so, confronted with all of these observations, Parker had an idea. He thought that maybe the appendix had a key role. Maybe its role was when you get a bad gut infection, just terrible diarrhea that wipes you out and kills your good microbes due to something that you ate or something that you got from somebody else, that maybe your appendix is kind of a nature reserve of your gut, a Yellowstone of your innards, and that the good microbes in your appendix then colonize your gut and reestablish what you need in order for your digestion to be normal, for your immune system to be normal. And Parker published this And I thought when he published it that immediately all the people who work on the appendix would write and say, "Oh, you're a fool. Why would you think that? We know about the appendix." But nobody wrote anything because it turns out nobody studies the appendix. The biological unknown is so big that we have whole organs that don't have specialists that focus on them. And so it sat there in the literature for a while. And with time, one of the predictions that Parker thought more and more about was that if he was right about the appendix, what you should see is that when people have severe gut infections, that if they still have their appendix, they should be more likely to recover. They should be more likely to be healthy again after the infection. And not long after Parker's study, another study showed that, at least for one group of patients, that people who had their appendix were 4 times more likely to recover from one bad gut pathogen, Clostridium difficile, than people who did not. That doesn't prove Parker is right, but it suggests he may be on to something, which I think is just amazing. And for you as a student, it means if you're interested in biology, the kinds of discoveries you can make even about humans are still fundamental. If you're interested in engineering, the kind of new engineering feats you could achieve that interface with biology are unimaginable. If you're interested in business, there are all sorts of products you could sell that relate to these phenomena. And it's not just the appendix. Deanna Beasley was a researcher at North Carolina State University a number of years ago. And while she was here, Deanna became very interested in the human stomach. And the standard story that probably you heard in high school is that the stomach, its key role is to break down proteins. It's very acidic, it has a bunch of enzymes for breaking down proteins, and that's its function. But Deanna noticed a bunch of things about the stomachs of different species that suggested that there might be something else going on. And one of the things that she noticed is that the stomachs of different species differ radically in how acidic they are. Some species have neutral stomachs. Some species, like humans and vultures, have very, very acidic stomachs. And it doesn't seem to relate just to how much protein they're eating. And so Deanna came up with a hypothesis that maybe what was going on was that the stomach was also working as a kind of gatekeeper to the intestines. And for species that were eating diets that exposed them to many pathogens, like vultures, like humans, like a few other species, that maybe that acidity helped to kill those pathogens so that they didn't become established in the intestines. And Deanna would go on to test this in a number of ways, and long story short, it looks like she was probably right, such that your stomach in your body right now is now thought to have a function we didn't think to be very important even a few years ago, thanks to research that happened here at NC State. And that's interesting in a basic biology perspective. It makes you wonder about the hummingbird's stomach and the goat's stomach and the pig's stomach. But it's also practically relevant because it tells us that if you do anything that lowers the acidity of your stomach, you might be predisposing yourself to infections you wouldn't otherwise be at risk for. And so it's a look into basic biology that then sets the stage for practical application. And as we look around the body, what we see again and again is that there are all sorts of totally new discoveries that await. And some, like the 2 I just showed you, have obvious practical consequences and others might not. For example, Megan Temis, who was a graduate student at North Carolina State University, just found that face mites, of which there are 2 known species that live in the follicles in humans, appear to be on all adult humans, which was not known until Megan's work. And so here's a species living on all adult humans all around the world that we really didn't understand was there in such abundance. And so that's a new kind of discovery. Is it useful yet? Probably not yet. But then something else was discovered. It was thought that those mites were chewing at your cells inside your follicles and eating what they found. But recently, a researcher at the Smithsonian actually found that they don't have any mouth parts for chewing. That's the state of our knowledge. We don't know what they're eating. We have no idea. We just know that they can't be chewing because they don't have any chewing things. And so often this is the place we find ourselves, is we find some totally unknown thing, and then we have to pause and think, where do we even go from here? And that's just 2 parts of the human body. It turns out that most of the human body is essentially just as undiscovered, just as poorly understood, such that there have been totally new discoveries about the apocrine glands in armpits, about mites that live in foreheads, about the sweat on feet and its potential function, about many other features of the body. And so as you think about your body, think about how undiscovered it is, Think about what that means for species around us, all of which are more poorly studied than humans. And think about the reality that there may be millions of species of insects yet to be named, millions of species of fungi, and billions or even a trillion species of bacteria. What is it that we don't yet know? I can't tell you. I can just tell you that it's extraordinarily grand. My final point is one that I'm going to tell you rather than show you, because we hope to show you this point throughout the rest of the course. There are not many ways to deal with the wicked problems of the world, especially the wicked problems that involve the biological unknown. Problems that have many dimensions, whether those are biological or otherwise. Problems like COVID-19. COVID-19 is a crisis, but it's a crisis at the interface of so many things that we don't yet understand well enough. And so how are we going to rise to this crisis? How are we going to deal with it? How are we going to make the right decisions? The answer to that has many details that we're going to explore. But I think the big picture is actually somewhat simple. The big picture is that as we deal with this crisis and other wicked problems in the future, that we need to have humility. We need to remember that we don't know everything and we can't know everything. We need to also remember that we need to have as much in-depth knowledge as we can have about the details of the specific problem. And finally, we need to understand that we can only make sense of those details in light of the broader perspective that's offered by a diversity of views, a diversity of ways of seeing the world. And that diversity includes different disciplines: economics, engineering, biology, statistics, psychology, anthropology, archaeology, and more. And you'll hear from those disciplines in this course. But it also relies on insights from a diversity of people experiencing whatever the wicked problem at hand happens to be. It's only through seeing with all of our eyes and lenses and expertise and tools that we can get a good enough sense of what we face to make the right decisions. Let me give you the example of the parable of the blind men and the elephant. A group of blind men happen upon an elephant and begin to consider what it is that they've found. One man grabs the tusk and thinks he has a spear. Another man grabs the foot and thinks he's found a tree trunk. Another man grabs the tail and is pretty sure he stumbled upon a snake. Another man still touches the side and finds a wall. The observations of each of these men are true. They've landed upon something true about the world, and they should continue to investigate what it is that they've found. But the only way they're going to make sense of their observations is by talking to each other to get a sense of the big picture. Now, time has passed since the parable of the elephant, and no longer are we just grabbing what's before us, but we're exploring it with many different disciplines: psychology, biology, engineering, archaeology, history, literature, even film. And each of those offers some perspective on the problems before us, problems as wicked as COVID-19. And on their own, they can show us a great deal, but it's only by combining those insights that we fully see. And this would be true if we mostly understood the world, but we don't mostly understand the world. Most of the world is yet to be understood. And so every time we confront a wicked problem, we are confronting the elephant from many perspectives, none of them complete. Now, I've introduced the parable of the elephant to you in the abstract. It's an imaginary elephant, they're imaginary blind men. But the truth is, every day that I go to work, I confront some version of this parable. And now I study funny things. I study the biodiversity of belly buttons, the life in armpits. I study how to make new kinds of beer. And in doing so, one of the things I've realized is that I can't study those things without the public. I can't study those things without insights from the people living with those species. But I've also come to realize that almost invariably, as I confront a particular problem, that I need the help of somebody from a different discipline. And recently I've spent a lot of time studying sourdough bread that relies on what happens when you mix flour and water, and then something magical and microbial begins to take place. And so as we started studying sourdough bread, I started to realize that the scientific literature about sourdough bread was missing really the history of sourdough bread. When did it start to become common? Why did it become rare? And how do we make sense of it? And so I brought in my friend Matthew Booker from history. And then I realized I don't really understand the archaeology of sourdough bread. What happened before history? How old is this? Is this just a fun thing we do in our kitchen, or is it important to the human story? And so I made another call to my friend Tate Paulette, who's an archaeologist on campus. And so we started to study those things. And I also needed my friend Ann Madden, who's a world expert on yeast. Ann knows yeast the way that you might know your family members. And I couldn't do this without her. And so each part of this built on each other part. And so the project would go on like this until by this point in the project, we now have scholars from 8 different disciplines studying sourdough bread. And sourdough bread, in some ways, it's an easy problem. It's water and flour, you mix them, they start to bubble, you have a microbial community. With that, if you've done it right, the CO2 makes the bread rise and the acid makes it sour. And it's just a handful of species to study. So it's the opposite of a wicked problem. It's a simple problem. And still, to see it clearly, I needed all these disciplines. And so imagine how much more important it is to have all of these disciplines to deal with these truly wicked problems. Problems that are far more complex than a loaf of bread. It's only through seeing with all of our eyes and lenses and expertise and tools that we can get a good enough sense of what we face to make the right decisions. And here I'll pause to say that not everybody has to confront the wicked problems. But by coming to a university that focuses on basic scholarship and how we think about the world, and on making change in the world, that you've come to a place that specializes in preparing you for dealing with those wicked problems. And so I hope that you are among those that engage those wicked problems of the future, because you will have the skills of humility, of deep knowledge, and of interdisciplinarity that are going to be required again and again and again.